Alright guys, so in this video I'm going to be discussing the plan that Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany had for Moscow, Russia. If they were to take it, Adolf Hitler was quoted in late 1941 as Operation Barbarossa was progressing, and the plans for Moscow changed quite a bit from what the Nazis originally intended on doing. Reich Commissariat, the original name for the plan of what Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany wanted to do with the westernmost part of Russia, including Moscow. Originally, they had envisioned a European Russia, keeping Moscow as a capital, and we can speculate on what would actually happen to the eastern parts of Russia if the Nazis had defeated Russia. There's also speculation, what if the Nazis took Moscow? Would Stalin have been overthrown, or would he possibly have moved the capital somewhere east and tried to reestablish? If Moscow would have been taken, would Russia have fallen? And if that happens, is there a potential collapse with possibly Imperial Japan coming from the east and Germany coming from the west? I think that's very unlikely. I'm guessing what would happen if they actually took Russia, they would set up a Russian puppet state east of the Ural Mountains, and Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler would take all of the area west of the Urals in Russia as Lebensraum. The original plan, which tracks back to April of 1941, a few months before the massive land invasion of the Soviet Union, suggests that Nazi Germany originally wanted to keep Moscow as the capital of Russia if they overtook it. However, as the war was progressing, as Barbarossa was progressing, those plans changed, and Adolf Hitler decided that he wanted to flood Moscow completely by opening the Volga Canal. This was discussed in mid-July, a month after Barbarossa, where he stated how he wanted the territories on the eastern side of Russia to be divided. But yes, they wanted to flood Moscow, Russia, and turn it into an artificial lake. And I just envision, Adolf Hitler and how much he hated communism, not even leveling the Kremlin, just leaving the Kremlin up, opening the Volga Canal, and just flooding it with all the buildings still up. Now, that wouldn't have happened. They were going to destroy and demolish all of the buildings within Moscow and then flood it after. It's just a crazy scenario if Nazi Germany would have taken over Russia. When you look at Russia and just how gigantic it is, I guess technically it's not as big as it's shown on a world map. It's distorted, but it still is very large, and Nazi Germany realized that they were never going to really fully eradicate Russia, at least on the eastern side, although it really was purposeless. The eastern part of Russia, a lot of it's uninhabitable, it doesn't matter, and they were mainly focused on the land west of the Urals. I do wonder, in the scenario where Nazi Germany gets Moscow, they set up at the Ural Mountains, what happens to eastern Russia? Does it stay as kind of a Nazi puppet state? Are there still Russians trying to fight in small pockets in that massive, vast area? It's an interesting hypothetical, but either way, that was Adolf Hitler's plan. In terms of Moscow, originally, they had thought possibly to set it up as a puppet capital, but then at a certain point, they wanted to just completely flood the entire capital of Moscow and eradicate communism and eliminate the entire population. At that point, around 4 million people in Moscow. That was the plan for Moscow if they would have taken it and if they would have forced Russia to surrender. This is just, I would say, more of a realistic hypothetical map if Nazi Germany would have defeated the USSR. You can see the Soviet Union still existing. They would virtually be a puppet state at that point. They wouldn't be powerful at all. Nazi Germany would have Moscow and all the other major cities, Stalingrad, Leningrad, and what have you, and they would have most of Europe, of course. That is in a Nazi Germany victory over the Soviet Union. But either way, guys, that's just the story of Adolf Hitler possibly wanting to create an artificial lake over Moscow after demolishing all of the buildings, the government buildings surrounding the city. Now, if Nazi Germany had defeated the Soviet Union, there were going to be three main areas that Germany would have split Russia and the eastern half of Europe into, with one of them being based around Moscow, another one in Ukraine, and then another one located to the north, mainly making up multiple present-day countries, including Lithuania. That is kind of how they were going to do it, and I don't think they would have taken much land east of the Urals. That land is mostly uninhabitable, meaning that during the winter months, it is too cold. You can barely live there. And also, the hypothetical of Japan collapsing in on Russia from the east as the Nazis come from the west, to me, that's extremely unrealistic based on Japan's limited land military capabilities. They couldn't even successfully occupy China, although I will say a lot of that land would have been easy to take if you are Japan. It just depends, did they really want to have that much land located in eastern Russia, depending on if the Axis actually won. Of course, Japan lost to the United States, so that point doesn't really matter. This is more of a hypothetical under the idea that Japan doesn't do Pearl Harbor, doesn't bring America into it, and possibly can converge with Germany onto Russia, similar to the way the Allies did to Germany, with Russia coming from the east and the United States, Great Britain, and other allies coming from the west landing on Normandy. But either way, that's just a crazy situation in terms of what Adolf Hitler might have done to Moscow, to the Kremlin, possibly knocking all the buildings down. I will say, to add context to this, what likely would have happened, they would have had a huge Battle of Moscow, and the city of Moscow would have very likely looked like what Berlin did in 1945. So you've got just shell buildings. I don't know if you guys have seen the aerial shots, the photos of Berlin, of Germany in general, of Austria in 1945. The buildings are just completely skeleton, and there would have been a huge Battle of Moscow. Even if Germany would have taken it, the city would have been completely destroyed anyways, and it would have been skeleton buildings, and it would have been very easy for, Nazi Germany to just knock those buildings down, rather than like the idea of the buildings being perfectly preserved and just flooding the entire area. That's not how it would have happened, because if Germany actually did overtake the capital, it would have been a brutal, brutal war. They only got onto the western outskirts of Moscow, and there was technically a Battle of Moscow, but it wasn't really directly in the city. That's why pretty much all of the buildings were completely fine within Moscow and preserved after the war. So either way, guys, that is going to do it for this video. Make sure you follow me on X. Link to that's always in the description.